Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this Resolution Foundation event. My name is Torsten Bell. I'm the Chief Exec of the Foundation. Now, remember before the pandemic, and in 2019, there was a general election. Some of you remember this. Remember these happen every 5 years, generally. That means there might be one coming up. And in that election, insofar as there was a row about universal credit and the welfare system, it was whether or not universal credit, this new system replacing 6 benefits with one system, should be scrapped entirely and replaced. That's what the Labour manifesto in 2019 promised. That won't be what the row is at the election that happens probably later this year, although Kaylee's warning me to prepare for January because she likes to get my blood pressure up. So that won't be the row, partly because it's way too late. The system's rolled out. Only a madman would start from scratch, having watched how big changes to the benefit system affect people, including some of the most vulnerable in society, but also partly because the system has benefits and the parties are recognising that. So we won't be talking about that. Instead, we'll be talking about whoever wins this election will be governing a country where universal credit's 10 years in we are now, long rollout basically comes to a conclusion over the course of the years afterwards. So whoever wins will be governing a country where 7 million households get universal credit. They should really care about it, but we're not going to talk about it much in this election campaign because no one's promising to scrap it, because that's democracy, people. So that is what's going to happen. So we're not going to pay attention to that. We're going to talk about it a lot today. So are you. Thank you all for coming. And we've got a report out this morning, authored by Alex Clegg, one of our economists at the Resolution Foundation, giving you just a big overview of where the system's up to, how the system is changed over the course of its 10 years of rollout, who the winners and losers are from this system, big change to the benefit system, who wins and who loses from that system, how much of those winners and losers are driven by universal credit itself, and how much are they driven by cuts to the system that have been happening at exactly the same time, big thing to keep separate in your heads, and then what happens next. And then we're going to have a discussion about it. And to help us do that, we've got a great panel. So you're going to hear from Kaylee Hignall, who's Head of Policy for Families, Welfare and Work at Citizens Advice, and has been doing great work in this area right through those 10 years. She looks very young, but she's been going forever. And has been wrestling with all of those traumas. And then from Devon Galani, who's been going for even longer, Director of Policy and Practice. Sorry, this is meant to be insulting. Yeah. It's good to be experienced. We value that. Unfortunately, we were meant to be joined by a representative from the department itself, but they've had a diary clash, so you've got a great panel instead. And then you guys can engage as ever. If you're in the room, you can ask questions by raising your hand, and if you're not, it's on Slido and it's #universal credit, and we'll go through. We'll do quite a lot on the substance, but we'll also get a bit into what's actually happening on the ground as the system's rolled out, and also the interaction between this system and other parts of the benefit system, which are in the news, unlike universal credit right now, for example, for some of the disability benefits. So that is the plan. Right, Alex, what is in this report?
Okay.
More importantly, what's going on for the country?
Okay. Before I start, I just want to thank Mike Brewer for all the help that he's given me on the report. 2024, as we mentioned, is going to be a big year for universal credit. Managed migration, the process by which claimants of legacy benefits are systematically moved over to universal credit, is really picking up in earnest. Claimants of a wide range of legacy benefits are expected to be moved this year. And as Torsten mentioned, we're going to have an election, probably. The winner of which...
We're definitely going to have an election.
Just don't know when.
This year, next
It's not over.
I stand by probably, we're going to have an election. And the winner of the election is going to be overseeing a system that's covering 7 million families by the end of the next parliament. So they really need to understand how the system is operating now, not just the thinking around it when it was brought in, when it was announced in 2010. Taking a quick look at where we are. Critics talked about the slow rollout, but things have really been picking up since the beginning of 2019 when claims for new legacy benefits closed. And then obviously there was this big spike in claims during the pandemic. And the universal credit caseload is now about double what the legacy benefit caseload is. So we're about 2/3 of the way there, and that's going to increase a lot again this year. And an obvious question when we're talking about the difference between the two systems is how does universal credit compare in generosity to the system it's replacing? And it's a little bit of a complex answer. It's true that the generosity of the entire benefit system has declined by quite a lot since universal credit was introduced in 2013. This is the basic level of out-of-work support on universal credit. which mirrors that of the legacy system, and has declined by about 7% since 2013, with a little dip recently, and has gone back up. So, families that are entitled to universal credit now in 2024 are on average £1,400 per year worse off than they would have been on legacy benefits in 2013. But that's conflating austerity cuts that happened across both systems with the structural changes that universal credit brought in. And that's one of the things that we've tried to get at in the report, is what effect have those structural changes had in isolation. And there's been two groups in particular that have seen really big changes. The first is working renters, who are the biggest winners from this structural change when they move from legacy benefits to universal credit. A lone parent working 30 hours per week at the national living wage will be £3,800 per year better off on universal credit than the legacy benefit system. This is largely to do with the single rate of withdrawal that universal credit brought in compared to the multiple overlapping rates of withdrawal in the legacy benefit system. Specifically for this case, it's in the old system they would be claiming housing benefit and working tax credit at the same time, which both had their own rates of withdrawal, which would interact with each other to withdraw support faster than universal credit. We can clearly see that the blue line is going up faster than the red line, which means working renters are among the biggest winners. And the other group seeing a big change is people with disabilities. Some people with disabilities are among the biggest losers on universal credit, whilst others who are out of work for ill health tend to gain a little bit. So people who were eligible for the severe disability premium on universal credit, that's people who are claiming support for the extra costs of universal credit, but they don't have a full-time carer. They're £2,800 per year worse off when they claim universal credit. But because of the way that universal credit has restructured support for ill health and disability, people who are out of work with ill health but don't claim this extra disability support, or people who aren't eligible for the severe disability premium, will be around £1,400 better off. It's kind of raised the base level of out-of-work support for ill health by reducing some of the disability premiums. But this is far, as we can see on the next slide, this is far from a net neutral trade-off. We're looking here at average entitlement between the legacy system and universal credit for all families that are entitled. As we can see, those that were previously entitled under the old system to employment and support allowance, which is the main out-of-work benefit due to ill health, are the biggest losers on average. Families lose on average £2,100 in entitlement from switching to universal credit from legacy benefits. And the pattern that we see here is driven a lot by the aforementioned gains for workers and working renters in particular, and losses for people with disabilities. So couples and couples with children who are more likely to be in work tend to do better when they switch to universal credit in terms of entitlement, whereas single people who are disproportionately likely to be disabled or out of work with ill health tend to lose the most on average. And this pattern of winners and losers is actually driving some quite big impacts on the country. Eventually, at full rollout, universal credit will shift £2.1 billion of benefit entitlement towards London and the South East and away from the rest of the country. This is largely to do with London and the South East having a higher proportion of renters, especially people paying really high rents, whereas some of the areas that have seen the biggest proportional drops, so the North East and Yorkshire, have much higher proportions of people who are out of work due to ill health. So this is 7% of working age adults in the North East and 6% in Yorkshire are out of work due to ill health currently. And because of the way that universal credit restructures their support, we see big drops in benefit entitlement on average in these regions. Another thing that universal credit set out to do was to one thing that universal credit did when it came in is to extend support to higher levels of earnings than the legacy benefit system did. This is just because it withdraws support at a slower rate. This is looking at the system in 2013, the universal credit system when it was introduced versus the legacy system at the time. Since then, we have reduced the generosity of out-of-work support, but at the same time extended the generosity of in-work support within universal credit only. The result of that is that the gap now between the two systems at the highest level of earnings at which you can get support is the biggest that it has ever been. This is for a couple with 2 children who are paying an average rent. Support for universal credit will run out at gross earnings of about £67,000 compared to about £41,000 on the legacy benefits. So you can see that universal credit has really changed the way support works for people who are in work. And this was by design. One of the big drivers behind the reform was a kind of carrot and stick approach to moving people who were out of work into work. The carrot was to reduce some of the really weak work incentives that the legacy system had. Here we're looking at all families eligible for a legacy benefit who are in work, and we're looking at their marginal deduction rates, which is for every extra pound of gross earnings, how much is lost to tax and benefit withdrawal. The most common is 69% for people on working tax credits who are also paying national insurance and income tax. But what policymakers at the time were really concerned about is those towards the right here paying 70, 80, 90% marginal deduction rates from some of those interacting withdrawal rates on the legacy system. Universal credit all but eliminates this. When we're looking at everyone who's entitled for both systems, 1.4 million people in work on the legacy system have marginal deduction rates above 70%, and that drops to just 165,000 under universal credit. But at the same time, universal credit consolidates these marginal deduction rates in a still quite high 50 to 70% band by bringing people who were further down, paying lower marginal deduction rates, into that single 55% taper. So you can kind of see it as removing some of the really weak work incentives, but actually weakening some work incentives for some groups. So removing some of those really weak incentives was part of the carrot. The stick of getting more people into work has been this increase in work search conditionality, and universal credit has done this in 2 ways. The first has been to extend work search conditionality rules to quite large groups under the legacy system that were never subject to these rules. So that's people receiving housing benefit only, or people receiving tax credits who didn't have any kind of work search rules tied to their claims. Universal credit, by bringing these benefits under one kind of umbrella, extends these conditionality rules to these people. The second big change is that it extends conditionality to people who are in work for the first time. So people who are working but not deemed to be earning enough, not earning above a threshold. It applies conditionality rules for these people to increase their hours, increase their earnings. They have rules put in place that they should follow. The result of this is there's now 2.7 million people on universal credit with some kind of work search conditionality, including 840,000 in work, and that compares to just 1.1 million JSA legacy benefit claimants in 2013. And a lot of people, because of this, have pointed at a higher rate of sanctions on universal credit. This is when people have their benefits reduced for failure to follow some of the rules that are put in place for them. And it's true that sanctions on universal credit have been higher than legacy benefits over time. But this comparison is not really looking at a like-for-like scenario. Under universal credit, you can be sanctioned, and indeed the most common reason for being sanctioned is for failure to attend a mandatory work search interview with a work coach. Under job seekers allowance, the main out-of-work benefit in the legacy system, a few incidences of no contact with a work coach the claim would simply be closed. Universal credit, they can't do this because it includes support for housing and children, and they can't leave people with no income whatsoever. So when we remove those interview-related sanctions from the universal credit side of the data, we actually see a very similar rate of sanctions between universal credit and job seekers allowance, suggesting that there hasn't really been much of a change in approach between the two systems, although you can see from the fluctuation here that there has been a bit of a change in approach over time, especially during the pandemic when they froze all conditionality rules. But the key question for these changes in work incentives and conditionality is what effect have they really been having in the real world? At the moment, the evidence is inconclusive. There's clear evidence from the DWP research that new claimants of universal credit are more likely to move into work quicker than claimants of job seekers allowance if they are single or lone parents. But this is obviously not a comprehensive assessment. It doesn't look at other family types, and also how quick people move into work isn't the only way of measuring this. One thing that we can see is lone parents in particular responding to the removal of the incentive in working tax credits to work exactly 16 hours. Under the old system, lone parents would get a big boost in income if they worked 16 hours because they become eligible for working tax credit. And universal credit smooths this out, so it essentially makes working at shorter hours viable for the first time for this low-income group. Here we're looking at lone parents in low-skilled jobs, which we're using as a kind of proxy for people who are likely to be eligible for in-work support. And what we're seeing is that since 2013, the proportion of this group who are working exactly 16 hours if they're in work has fallen from 25% to 11%. And at the same time, those working short hours from 1 to 15 hours a week has increased from 10% to 15%. What's not clear from this is if this group who are increasing their hours at the bottom end is people who were previously out of work who are deciding that it's now viable for them to go into work because of universal credit, or indeed if it's people who were working more who have decided that it's more in their interest to work less now that they receive less of an income drop from reducing their hours below that 16-hour threshold. So we've seen what universal credit intended to do for people in work in particular, for changing the way that support works. But arguably, the way that universal credit is geared towards people who are unemployed is less of a labour market challenge in 2024 than it was when universal credit was first announced. Unemployment was at 8.5% in 2011, and it was just 3.8% at the end of 2023. But at the same time, the caseload of people who are out of work with ill health has almost doubled from 1.2 million in 2013 to 2.3 million now. This is likely to be the big challenge for the incoming government in terms of universal credit, but also one thing we argue in the report is it's going to take a much more holistic approach involving health policy, education policy, labour market policy. And this is one of the major things that the incoming government has to get to grips with when they consider how they are going to adapt universal credit going forward. This has died. There we go. So in conclusion, whoever wins the next election needs to understand how universal credit is operating now, not just the thinking that was around at the end of the 2000s, early 2010s around this big benefit reform. As we've seen, universal credit has led to some really huge shifts in who the system has geared towards, with working renters amongst the biggest winners and people with disabilities amongst the biggest losers. And universal credit is operating in a much different context from the one in 2010 when it was announced, and there are going to be some big challenges ahead. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. Turns out a decade doesn't just change us all as people, it changes benefit systems, and it changes, and we're going to come back to this, it changes the country that the benefit system is applying to, and that's a very, very big deal that doesn't get a lot of discussion. Katie, what do you reckon?
Yeah, well, I've had 2 kids in that time, so a lot has changed. Yeah, I could talk about this forever, and
Don't do that.
I know I have a lot to say about universal credit always, but I'm going to try and keep myself to 3 points here. And the first being that, UC isn't a single reform. It pulls together several reforms of load-bearing parts of the system. So just before UC came in, you had reform to LHA, local housing allowance, you had ESA introduced, and then obviously we were overlaying that with more and more reform. And that's important to bear in mind for 2 reasons. The first is we lifted and shifted the good, the bad and the ugly from the legacy system into universal credit. And that we didn't really know how those things were working. The scale of evaluation does not match the scale of reform at the moment. So we don't know what fits into those buckets effectively. And also, it's understandable, it's a huge, massive challenge to operationalise such levels of reform, but we have to remedy it. The next government has to be able to know what works and what hasn't worked in the system. And as Alex mentioned, we've got some small bits of evidence now, very welcome, around the outcomes within the system, but we don't know much about the assumptions that went in, we don't know much about the mechanisms, and outcomes are limited to small cohorts of claimants, so lots to do there. The second thing I would say is that benefit levels that don't cover essential costs have both an impact on people but on policy levers too. You know, at Citizens Advice we can see that nearly 5 million people are in negative budgets and a further 2.3 million people are going without to make the books balance. That effectively means that after advice, people's costs are outweighing their incomes substantially. And there's nothing we can do about it in terms of getting more benefits in or reducing their costs going out. They are stuck in that situation. And then when we look at UC, we see 1 in 4 households receiving UC are in a negative budget. That compares to 1 in 15 for the general population. So a huge amount of financial stress for those people. The policy impact here is that it exacerbates so many of the rough edges and the trade-offs within universal credit's design. You take the 5-week wait, you look at deductions, or even the unpredictable payment levels that people can have because of the payment cycle in UC. And what you end up with is much more problematic issues for people affected by those. People are finally balancing very tight margins of income and outgoings, have a huge amount of cognitive overload, a lot of risk, a lot of complexity, and a lot of urgency in the issues. And when we look at what we see at Citizens Advice, we're more likely now to be first dealing with crisis. Do you need a food bank? Do you need a fuel voucher? Before we can get on to the substantive advice issue around, for example, benefits, housing, debt, whatever it may be. And if you think about specific levers within that, like looking at financial incentives, we've looked a lot at the spreadsheets and the charts. The fineness of those margins is effectively for those people going to be swallowed up by debt for a big chunk of people. If debt within universal credit or debt external to it, all essential bills and the like, not kind of credit and things where you might have a bit more flexibility on payment. So there's a real challenge there. Before you even get to the challenge of like people having to weigh up the challenges of working against the financial incentives, do they feel materially better off if that money is going straight into debt because of the financial situation of large chunks of the population? So that has to have an impact on people's decision making, and it has to have an impact on that lever in terms of financial incentives and their effectiveness. And the last thing I would say is, Torsten, you started off by saying, you know, there's disability benefits and there's universal credit. To me, universal credit is a disability benefit. We forget it far too often. And I know in terms of policy levers, in terms of teams in DWP, and even within teams of Job Centre, you're talking about different people, but ultimately it is a disability benefit. And from my mind, it's relatively stuck in an unemployment model. The levers within the system that are used basically look at whether you have a severe impact from your disability or health and then hive you off the system. And if not, they shove you back into an unemployment system. It's not a disability benefit system in its design. If you take a step back and look at first principles of serving disabled people and their needs, I think it would look pretty different to what we have now. I think you'd see something that's much more connected to other systems that themselves need work on, say health and social care. I think you'd see support that was much more linked to occupational therapy or occupational health, rather than, say, for example, an emphasis on CVs and interview support. I think it would be much more proactive. The role of early intervention within health and life, I think in general, is really, really clear. But actually the system waits quite a long time in universal credit before it starts targeting support at you. And it certainly doesn't target support from other bits of the system. So, you know, your work capability assessment in UC might say, oh, you could do with some aids and adaptations. That would make a difference to whether you are able to do X, Y, Z. But it doesn't tell you that, and it doesn't help you get those aids and adaptations. It actually factors in as if they exist when they potentially don't for that person. So there's a huge amount there, mechanisms within it that could be used. Of course, there's some interesting progress on this. Like there's a little bit more on occupational health, a bit more on brokerage, which I think is really important for these groups of people. And I'm really interested in what's happening in the work well model. That looks quite interesting as well. But there's much, much more to do. And I would say quite a lot of pushing to do against falling into the same model here of tightening criteria and eligibility and increasing conditionality for these groups. We've done it 3-4 times in recent decades and it hasn't worked. So we must move on to something else.
Great, thank you very much, Katie. Loads of great food for thought in there. And lots to come back to, particularly on the disability side. Definitely.
Thanks. Firstly, great report, really useful, especially since the last time I looked at one of these, it's probably in depth, was probably 2014, and a huge amount's changed in universal credit since then. You've had changes to the taper rate, changes to work allowances, and obviously as this report focuses on changes to entitlements, so who gets how much. But I guess I want to start by saying, if we put who gets how much to one side, I think it'd be really interesting to get kind of feedback from the room on this, but I think universal credit's kind of shown itself objectively to be a better system on which to build a benefit system. So you've got something that was able to respond to the pandemic relatively flexibly, introduce something like the £20 uplift. We'd be able to do things like more rapid uprating if we wanted to. All of these things were impossible under the legacy system, which again, you have to remember you had 3 different agencies, each of which, responsible for administering their own benefits, wouldn't have coped with anything like what we had to deal with in the pandemic. So this idea that it is a better system on which to build is probably something to put the kind of policy decisions to one side and maybe reflect on that first of all. The incoming government in a universal credit nation will have arguably some more choices open to it because it's a better system. I think the second point I wanted to pull out was just this idea of focusing on renters, working renters and people with ill health as kind of I wouldn't necessarily pull those out actually. Looking at kind of reflecting on the report as you were speaking really as much as anything else, I think we're focusing on 2 things. So one is the drivers outside of the system that are pushing benefit costs up. So I think that's housing costs. One reason why people in the South benefit more because of this kind of emphasis on housing costs. And this focus on health, as Kaylee's already spoken about, but I'll come on to that in the Q&A, but basically agree with everything Kaylee said. So you can get my take on that if you want. But so much more to do there. I'd say the biggest story in the report is this shift from this focus on in-work support, deliberate policy choices to emphasize cuts in the taper rate, cuts in the withdrawal rate, over while also introducing cuts in base levels of out-of-work support and not reintroducing support for certain groups, particularly disabled people who perhaps you wouldn't expect them to be able to increase their earnings through work, yet they've seen some cuts, some pretty serious cuts as you've shown, to their levels of out-of-work support. Are those justified? What can we do about that? And then I think if we kind of take the bigger stories, again, I spoke a little bit about it in terms of housing costs, a little bit in terms of kind of health, but also you've got rising cost of living, huge things happening there, debt as Kaylee mentioned. And I think you have to remember that universal credit operates within this wider economic system that we've got. And often when we talk about social security, we talk about that as the solution to the problems without realizing that actually it's kind of a sponge that is the basis on which we deal with the problems we've created elsewhere. And I think kind of being clear about what expectations we have of universal credit, when actually some of those problems would be better dealt with outside of the social security system. We just need to be honest about those and also be honest about the trade-offs within universal credit. So again, if we're talking about support for people with disabilities, there is a trade-off there. Of course, you could increase support for people with disabilities, people without disabilities, people in work, as well as people out of work. That's all going to cost more money. So if you're going to take a fixed budget envelope, you kind of need to be explicit about saying, do we want to increase support for disabled people? Is that kind of what this report's saying? Or is it saying actually we prefer to increase the standard allowance to the essentials guarantee, for example? These are kind of just genuine trade-offs within the system that if we get back to, as you say, we're inheriting arguably a better system, we still have to make these difficult, an incoming government is still going to have to make these difficult choices. And perhaps kind of we as policymakers need to be more explicit about which choices we'd encourage them to make in that scenario.
Great, thank you very much, Evan. There's no way around trade-offs in the benefit system. That's generally basically true. Right, okay. Now, that's a lot to get through. And there's a lot of questions online, like a lot. Maybe don't ask anymore. I basically can't cope. What were you saying about cognitive load? So but in the room, put your hand up if you want to ask questions. Now, I thought we should let's start very big picture, and then let's go through design questions and winners and losers. So we'll start with one admirably quick question, which Devon has actually already answered his view on, but Kaylee and Alex can have a go. Here it is. So basically, has it been a success? So this is something that wasn't in the 2010 manifesto, turned up within 6 months after a general election, has then taken us 15 years to get to where we are, and by 2029 will basically be done. But it's a really big deal. I mean, if you think about like big things done by the government over the last 14 years, this is like on the list of very few, very large changes that affect a very large number of people. So Kaylee, success or not? Try not to fudge too much.
Well, I would separate this.
Oh, here we go.
This is my fudge. No, operationally
Yep.
and delivering major system reform, pulling all of those things together, as Devon mentioned, of the legacy system, getting it out to this many people, getting that money out of the door when people need it. Yes, it is a success. That's not to say that there isn't delivery problems that still exist, same delivery issues that existed back when we started talking about this. But I can absolutely see the success of a major system rollout and operationalising it. In terms of is it a success because it works? Well, we don't know. That's the problem. We've talked about outcomes around people getting into work quicker. But I mean, I have bigger ambitions for the benefit system than that. I want people to get into better jobs. I want people to earn more. I want people to have more independence. We don't know the answer to those questions. What I would say as well is it's worth noting that we talked about trade-offs in the benefit system. They are inevitable, but there's questions in my mind, there has been always with universal credit, about who is facing the worst of those trade-offs. And often, and as we see today, I would say if you have additional needs, or if you have a vulnerability, if you have a disability or a health problem, you are facing a tougher time in universal credit. If you have churning work and work that is going up and down in terms of your hours and your earnings, you're having a more difficult challenge in the system.
Explain why that last point might be.
So with monthly assessments, you're basically not sure what your income's going to be, and your payment schedule might not match the payment schedule of universal credit. So you get some rough edges in between. I'm not sure they're where I would have picked to put the trade-off, basically. I think other groups going through the benefit system need less support and less consideration. It's not to say they're not important, but certainly those are the groups that I would have prioritised to reduce those trade-offs and rough edges.
Alex?
Yeah, I'd agree that operationally it's been quite impressive. I don't think there's many people that would argue for a return of the really weak incentives of the legacy system and the poor take-up rates, especially for people in work. So yeah, I agree with what both of you said there. I think it is worth considering some of these rough edges of the system. There is an element of bringing in this huge kind of behemoth of a benefit system, which forces a lot of people to kind of follow the same rules. It's increased simplicity of the system, but at a trade-off of some people who might not fit neatly into the structure that universal credit puts into them. So people with disabilities, people with different working patterns, and as you say, Kaylee, some of them feel like they shouldn't necessarily be such a big pinch point. It wouldn't be. It doesn't feel like it would be that hard to solve the problem of the monthly assessment issue, for instance.
Very good. Let's get a question from the room.
Hello, I work for New Horizon Youth Centre. It's a youth homelessness charity in North London. We're seeing the highest rates of youth homelessness potentially ever in the country, and we're seeing a severe gap between the support that people get at 16, 17 in the care system, and then the support that people get over 25. 18 to 25-year-olds seem to be completely missed out of any conversation in general around homelessness, also around credit system, universal credit. They receive a lot less benefit. They receive lower housing benefit than under 35s, which they receive less minimum wage, but rent is the same. Wages are much less. You've got the same costs of everything else. So I feel like it's setting up young people to end adulthood in poverty and potentially in homelessness. So I just wonder what the panel had reflections on how important it would be to try and change the way that it works so anyone over 18 gets the same, why they think there might be a difference or a discrimination against young people, and what can be done in terms of campaigning for the general election so that young people don't get completely left behind within these systems.
Great. Okay. Let's unpack a few bits of that. So we definitely are seeing, it's not just young people actually, we're seeing record homelessness of lots of different kinds, of basically everybody, as we've gone through the last few years, and the benefit system is a lot of that. I think there's a lot of different bits going on. So there's like a long-term trend, obviously, towards taking decisions that younger people are entitled to lower levels of benefits. That's actually mainly predates universal credit, and in some ways universal credit's gone the other way, which I consider. But I think we should pick up on this, because one thing we say on the report is support for renters is up. But what we really mean is support for working renters is up, because for non-working renters, we've got a lot of cuts going on at the same time as a system that isn't more generous for them. So do you want to explain that a bit?
Yeah, and also support for working renters is up compared to the legacy system, but not necessarily up from what they might need or what covers their rent. I think you're referring to the standard allowance on universal credit being lower for people under 25, which is true. But one thing that universal credit has done is introduce support for the first time for people who are in work under 25, which the tax credit system didn't have. So it's, again, there's some small groups getting through the cracks there and some not. I don't think it makes much sense to have a lower standard allowance for people under 25. It's based on an assumption that people can go and live with their parents, which is obviously a really big assumption, and there's big big reasons why that's not true for many people.
Kelly, do you want to come in on this? You must see lots of this.
Yeah, our data matches what you're seeing on the ground there as well at Citizens Advice. And interestingly, whenever we see a slight easing, if you like, in terms of people needing crisis support, like we've had like £20 uplifts, or when we've had the additional payments for cost of living payments, we can see that kind of dip down. Homelessness doesn't respond to that in our data. It's very sticky, if you like, but once you're in that pathway, to get out of it is incredibly difficult. We have done some work recently as well looking at the shared accommodation rate within universal credit.
Remind everyone what the shared accommodation rate is for the less keen.
Yes, sorry. So assuming for those under 35, that you will move into a room in a rented accommodation rather than have your own accommodation. And what we've noticed there is the data that is based on is just completely terrible. Like I've not looked into it in this much detail, but it's based on a very small number of actual rental properties, and they're not available to people. So much like other challenges that universal credit has, it is detached from the reality of the market. So that data is what is used to look at aggregate and average rents in different areas. That data is very unreliable, but yet it's like the foundation for such a big part of that. That makes a huge difference to what people can afford. And particularly if you've got people who have additional needs and potentially living in a shared accommodation is not the option for them. So lots to do there. And I just want very technical, but there is actually some disincentives in the system, particularly for those who receive housing benefit and they're in care. Once they come into universal credit, there is a cliff edge there that is not often talked about, but for that group of people is very, very harsh and does need attention for sure.
Because overall, so as I say, because if you're at some point you want a government to look at the fact that you've got this record homelessness going on, okay? And it's homelessness broadly defined. We don't mean street sleeping. We mean people in lots of different situations. How much do we think that is really to do with universal credit, and how much is it to do with local housing allowance decisions and others? Is it really a universal credit decision or not?
I mean, I do take issue with separating them out. Like, for a claimant, for a person, they're not separate things. Like,
No, but the system design is.
Yeah.
The level of generosity is the same, whether you're in the legacy system or and that's the decision that's really driving the homelessness up.
Yeah, I think that as Devon had said around the problems that exist in the wider system and the benefit system picking it up, the ability for the benefit system to deal with the housing crisis is limited. And what we have seen through local housing allowances, I think a questionable bit of evidence around whether it is a lever in housing terms. So there was an assumption at some point that local housing allowance, by bringing benefits down, I'm not going to use percentiles in my response, by bringing benefit rates down, it would push people into cheaper accommodation. That's not what we've seen. So the benefit system's ability to deal with those issues, I think, is very limited. What I would say, though, is it has to accept the reality of the context that it is living within. You either try to change it or you accept it and design it in. At the moment, it's kind of neither.
Do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, 2 quick points. So I've been at too many Resolution Foundation events where we've talked about the housing crisis and the fact that this has been brewing for the last 10 years, and you guys kind of called it out on day one, and yet we haven't kind of dealt with the challenges outside the system, which means the benefit system's left with simply coping with the consequences. All you can do is pump more money toward renters, and that's literally pretty much the only option you've got. And I think if that's the way we look at it, you're only going to push up the cost of the social security system. Claimants are going to be blamed for it, even though it isn't their fault. And actually, you need to be able to put the focus in the right area. So I guess that's the first point. The second point, to kind of come back to your underlying question on homelessness, comes back to actually just helping someone out recently who had to find a new place to live due to a separation. It was a very difficult kind of situation for them. And I think, again, just generally going to the council, no one told him to apply for universal credit. He was in work, so assumed he wouldn't be eligible. Just didn't know about it, right? And these are just kind of really obvious rough edges in the system. And yes, that situation could be improved if you got more support for housing through universal credit or all these other kind of policy levers, but they're only relevant if you actually know about it or are encouraged to claim. And I think that's something that we often miss out when we talk about these things. We assume kind of the system on some level, everyone knows about it as much as we do, and no one does.
Thank God they don't.
Yeah.
That'd be a bad use of everyone's
They're
life.
far cooler than we are.
I wouldn't go that far.
Right,
Speak for yourself. Right, I just want to unpick some of we're talking about the system, but the system brings together a lot of things, a new computer system, a new actual benefits system that's operating under. So let's do our first poll, and then you guys can give us your take on this. So what's the best bit about the new system is basically, you can call it great achievement or not, but what's the best bit? So is it that it's simpler in the sense that the claimant, doesn't mean it's simpler under the bonnet, but it's simpler in the sense that you're only applying once for your benefits, although in practice often not more than once. Is it that it's a modern digital system? So the second one is the thing that actually meant the system didn't collapse during COVID. It wasn't that it was universal credit, it was that it was a modern IT system, not a bit of paper. And it's the trying to operationalise legacy systems that led to big queues outside the equivalent of job centres in Spain and America. So that bit is what gave us the COVID. Is it the thing that was originally focused on by Ian Duncan Smith, which is the incentives point? Okay, which those lines going a long way out down the income distribution, earnings distribution, I should say, are showing you lower taper rates than in the old system where you had a housing benefit taper and a tax credit taper overlaying each other, and so you've got a different set of work incentives, or is it budgetisation? And it is worth remembering. We say now, some people don't like the variation in their month-to-month universal credit bills. If you'd had a citizens' advice representative here in 2010, they would have said, it's terrible, the overpayments and underpayments in the system, it's not responsive enough, it's a complete disaster, we definitely need to deal with that. Not Kelly, but that, and it was a serious, as someone that was in government before then, it was a real problem trying to deal with overpayments, which we basically dealt with by just writing them off in lots of cases. So those are four different things. You're only allowed one. Haley, first, which one are you going for? What's the best one?
Simplification.
You prefer having one?
Yeah, yeah. The amount of times that I've sat there with people trying to do better off calculations, trying to weigh up what's going to happen in one system versus the other. I mean, it's still, I think, far away from being as simple as it could be, and there are trade-offs, of course, around making sure it matches people's needs, but pulling it together, if that's all you did, I would be happy with that, yeah.
Devon, what's your favourite?
I'd lean toward that, definitely. Simplification. I'd also add other parts of the social security system, whether it's council tax support or other types of social, they could learn a lot from, or just make a sensible decision in kind of leaning on the criteria on which universal credit's assessed to determine eligibility. It just
Remind
simplifies
me
things
what
further.
happens with council tax support?
So currently, well,
What doesn't happen?
yeah, it's quite a tricky question when you put it to me like that. But
Do the simple version.
yeah, no, for working age people, each local authority runs its own scheme. There is this mechanism where you can put your hand up for it if you apply for universal credit, but for some reason not everyone does. That's kind of an opt-in system rather than an opt-out system, which I think would make much more sense. And it's pretty complicated to figure out. Again, it's another kind of complexity to the system. A lot of local authorities ask for things like, are you getting personal independence payment, which again, you don't know about, or taking into account non-dependent income. These things universal credit doesn't take into account of, which means you then need to go and ask the individual for that extra bit of information. And it's largely entirely unnecessary, although we do work with a lot of local authorities helping them to assess their schemes. Trying to make these points, sometimes we make a difference.
Very good. Alex, what are you going for?
Well, I mean, you've both chosen simplification, and I would probably lean towards that, but I'll talk about digitisation.
Very good, well done.
You know, someone's got to. I think when we talk about greatest achievement, we have to consider like the greatest achievement in terms of how much it's helped people who claim, because there's really the people who are relying on it, and that's the big question. And I think it is quite hard to overstate how wrong it could have gone in the pandemic if we were relying on paper applications. But also, I think it's really important to understand, as Devon mentioned earlier, how the kind of options that universal credit gives us. And I think things like, we don't do this at the moment, but we do have the opportunity to have much more responsive uprating levels. You know, we saw during the cost of living crisis that the value of benefits was really playing catch up with increasing prices to the point where people were really, really struggling. We could have a much more dynamic, responsive system. But we've kind of got the architecture now to do that. It relies
So it basically takes us a few weeks to change the level of benefits in the new system, whereas under JSA and tax credits, our IT system took a very long time just to process we'd like to increase the level of, it took a few months, we'd actually like to increase the level of benefits is basically the thing. Okay, let's see what you voters thought. The general election isn't going to be about this, but the voting today is. What are you all going for? I'm worried you're all going to go for simplification because, you know, they're so convincing. Yes, okay, there we go. I think we should, to defend the digitisation second choice, yes, during the pandemic, but just generally having a modern system, basically governments, unless they had a big, can we imagine a world, right, where you didn't have a government that had a big reform to introduce, but had just introduced a new modern IT system because it was the right thing to do, generally? And probably the answer is no, they wouldn't have ever done it. So we would have gone through the pandemic with the old system. And we would have gone through a cost of living crisis without being able to. We would have been able to do the £20 a week, but it would have taken us a lot longer to put it in place. And also, it's the easier one for us all to like, because definitely having a functional IT system is a good thing for a benefits system. Generally, and we should say it wasn't like that originally. So we were doing this event back in 2014-13. Then all of our discussion would have been about how DWP had basically blown up an IT system, wasted squillions of pounds building it, and it was completely useless, and was then junking the first IT system and then building the IT system we have today. So the fact that it does work is a very good thing indeed. Right, design, winners and losers. So Susan has got a great question. So we've shown you here some of the winners and losers. And we'll come back to this renters, in-work renters, as of some of the big winners, particularly in high rent areas. The question is how much of these were intentional and how much of them were side effects of other design decisions over this thing. So Devon, did we intend for this to happen, or is this just we made other decisions?
I mean, all of these changes are entirely foreseeable based on the policies that were introduced at the time. So I think there are two to speak about. One is kind of the lower withdrawal rate, 55%, which is what we modelled in dynamic benefits. Of course, that's going to benefit working renters. It was obvious in 2013. It's kind of proven the case in this report.
Although no one talked about it. That isn't.
Well, people in work, incentivising people in work,
they
right?
used
So
that
supporting.
language. They didn't say renters. You're right. They said
workers.
They said.
It just affects renters more because they go higher up the income distribution, right? And I think this is actually probably a good thing because of the disparity between homeowners and renters. That's actually not not particularly. I think that works. Actually, that kind of works with the grain of the kind of policy we want to see. And then similarly for people with disabilities, there have been some changes introduced that to try and soften that effect. Severe disability premium being carried across, for example, for more people to kind of soften the blow as people moved across.
You mean in transitional protection?
Yeah. And you've got this kind of complex element of some people gaining and some people losing, which again we could see when it was originally modelled in dynamic benefits. So this is not in a sense it's foreseeable, but I guess in working on the report originally, no one expects this to be adopted wholesale with every single recommendation within it, right? So you can, my view was always, you can make these changes to the taper rate if you want to. You can make these changes to levels of support for disabled people if you want to. And actually, you'd expect kind of some active policy making within government around that. So
choices within the system. Basically.
Yeah, and you still have those choices, right? And they can be implemented far more rapidly within universal credit than perhaps they could have been in the system before.
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered that pretty well. It's hard to know what the intention is, but I think at the time it was really geared towards people in work, right? And that dynamic benefits report in particular, really geared towards the legacy system creates really big problems for people who are potentially moving into work. So I think the gains for people in work were inevitable and were by design. I think I kind of see the disability thing as a bit of a collateral for the will towards simplification. Like
exactly.
They looked at all the disability premiums, which, to be honest, took me a little while to get my head around right in the report. There's a lot going on there. And I think they saw that and thought we have to do something about this, which was to kind of iron it out. So some people lost and some people gained. Some people lost and some people gained. I don't think they set out to think we really need to hammer people with disabilities. We just
that's what's happened.
we focused on.
Yeah, the goal was to keep spending on disability support the same. Like, that was actually the goal.
Yes,
as well.
So that has been the goal for since I've been alive. That has been the goal of government. It's not going very well, but it's not going very well generally. And we keep cutting it, and yet the spending keeps going up. Kaylee.
Yeah, I'd agree on this point around disability and simplification and the kind of like trade-off there. I feel like all I'm saying today is trade-off and rough edges. Sorry about that. But I think that in the pursuit of simplification there, we've accidentally gone too far for this group, for the whole variety of experience of people who have disability and long-term health conditions. Like, it seems bizarre to me for the system to be pretty binary. Like, it's got 1, 2, 3 options if you think about it, and the journey through it, 2 really. And the journey through it is also pretty much the same, regardless of whether you have a short-term illness or a long-term progressive disability or health condition. And I think that's where there is loads of space for reform.
Let's come back on the WCE on that, because there's a lot we need to say about that. But on the general picture, do you agree, Alex, that the system wasn't, like, we weren't really thinking about ill health and disability, particularly when the system came in?
No, I mean, ESA was really new, and lots of elements of ESA hadn't actually been implemented when universal credit was starting to roll out. So it just kind of got overtaken, I think, and perhaps put on a we'll get to that list. Such a big reform. We've talked about the benefits of the digital approach and in-house capacity to build. The challenge with that is there's so much to build that you constantly are trying to catch up with yourself in terms of getting this system sorted for everybody, and getting down the list in prioritisation, not mine, but generally to disability and health, I think has perhaps got further and further down the list. Okay,
let's come back to that in a second. So one thing I was thinking about, was this what was intended? It does depend on who you mean intended. So if you went back, let's go back to 2010. So if you're George Osborne, you're saying the thing we need is, 1, to spend less money on the benefit system generally, but 2, I don't want all these middle-class, middle-income people getting benefits, right? So if you go to the 2010 election campaign, it was all like, we've got to chop tax credits off and stop these people who are earning like 40 grand, 50 grand, I can't actually remember the number at the time, but it's a long time ago. But anyway, basically middle-income, higher middle-income people, we've got to get them out of the benefit system, so we're going to chop off the top of tax credits, basically, was a system. And he thought that was a really important thing to do, as well as making the out-of-work system meaner, because you couldn't have people... what was his thing about the curtains? You didn't like... You went off to work, you saw people whose curtains were still drawn, then you thought the benefit system was bad because it was supporting the work shy, was basically the gist. Now, in terms of what he got, he has delivered on the cuts for the out-of-work stuff, and we haven't talked about that much. One of the dangers of the charts we've shown you today is because they tend to start at how many hours do you work, right? So they're all it looks like the whole population works, but there's lots of people sitting in that 0 hours work largely because they're disabled, or they have very, very young children. So you can end up focusing just on the working population, which is what the system was intended to be focused on. But in the real world, lots of people are not working for very good reasons, and for those people, the system is generally less generous, particularly when we take into account the cuts that have happened since. But we've ended up. I can't remember your exact how you phrased it in the report, but basically we've ended up with more middle income people in the system because IDS basically got what they wanted.
I mean, it depends if you compare to 2010 or 2013, because we brought in Osborne brought in some reforms in 2011, which did chop off that.
He chops it.
There's a much more, for all the nerds, there's a much more complicated version of the chart I showed in the report.
We don't insult the readers who are trying to lure them in.
I'm one of you.
Make it worse, come on.
Which has those lines for a lot more years, and you can it shows that for the Osborne reform brought back legacy benefits from that really high earnings level.
So he chopped off the top of Gordon Brown. Basically.
And since then it's crept back up and we've undone about half of it.
So you think we're not back to Gordon Brown in terms of how far up the income distribution you go?
I don't think this is the right way to look at this.
Give us another way.
I think it's what I said. Like the headline of this report is shifts in out of work support to in work, right? And you've got a system where that's and also what's driving the cost of the social security system. Most of what's in this report can be explained by those two things. So you've got a more expensive system because you've got higher costs of renting, or you've got more cuts and more people facing a cheaper system, but more people suffering hardship as a result because it doesn't cover the cost of living. So that's the first thing, is what's happening to the levels of out of work support.
But it's not the high level of rent that is pushing that line up. It's the choice to have a lower take
rate.
Rate.
Exactly. So that's pushing.
Yeah. So it is the universal credit system that's doing it. It's not because more people are renting. It's not because the cost of rents have gone up. They haven't particularly. It's because universal credit is more generous to renters. That's what's doing it. That's what's getting you those results.
Choices around the levels of out of work support is the point I'm making, right? So the levels of rent support you get and how much pressure that puts on people. So even if you get more support working, and hopefully you'll back me up on this, but if you get more support in work when you're renting, you're getting if the hardship level is greater, you're still having to make up that shortfall somehow through work. So you're still struggling more.
Yes.
And I think that's the picture you have to paint. So maybe people in work are struggling a little bit less. They're still struggling more because the cost of living has gone up.
Yes, and that goes back to the question about homelessness and people not being able to afford their rent generally.
Yeah, so you have to look at these choices around what's driving the cost, levels of support to meet that cost, and the choices as to whether that goes to people out of work and people in work. And I don't think yes, George had his views, none of them very particularly sensible or based on a strong working knowledge of the social security system. Ian had his views, which were based on a little bit more, but still.
Lucky they're not watching, otherwise everyone's been insulted in the last 5 seconds.
Yeah, but I think you have to. What we couldn't get through was this focus on you're trying to solve problems with the social security system that stem from outside.
That is definitely right. Let's come on to one of those then. Go on. Of course, Kelly.
On incentives here, I think something in terms of intent that I think probably could have been foreseen, but maybe not, is that we've had successive fiscal events where we're looking to reward hardworking Britain, and also looking for savings that you can slate, that you can see, so you can put it in and you say, right, that's going to generate this and cost this, and that leads you to financial incentives. And so we've just repeatedly gone down this track of financial incentives are the way that you invest in the benefit system. It gives you a smart political narrative. It gives you something that the Treasury need in terms of...
So you mean specifically cutting the taper rate?
Yeah, cutting the taper rate. The rest of it, in terms of investing in how you deal with disability, potentially even standard allowance, how you deal with some of the rough edges, they're much harder. The narrative is much harder. How you deal with it in Treasury terms is much harder. And I suspect when universal credit was designed that the intent wasn't that you would then wholly focus on one side of that equation and push. We've talked about the benefits of universal credit. We had 4, there was loads, but we've focused in terms of investment on one of those throughout its whole 10, 15 years of existence. So it has become very imbalanced, I think, because of that, perhaps unintentionally.
So that's a good big picture. point, and then I'm going to move us on to disability, which is, so that if you take the longer term trend, so forget universal credit for a second, you should do like the last 40 years of the social security system,
Yep.
we have been ever more ratcheting down the basic level of support, which became the basic level of in-work support as well as out-of-work support, right? That's going on, that's Alex's one of his very first charts on the generosity of the basic level of out-of-work support, with the exception of the £20 jump, is basically a story of it getting ever meaner. It was 30% of average earnings in the 70s, it's now 14. It's about half what it was in the 70s in terms of relative to average earnings, okay? The basic level of support. Generally, over those 30 years until 2010, the deal was that system's going to get ever less generous, but we will increase other bits of the system which will stop poverty totally shooting up. So those were basically disability support and rent support. Those will rise, and kids. And kids, particularly in the 2000s. Those support will rise, extra cost support will go up. It will compensate for the fact that the system is incredibly mean and becoming meaner in terms of the basic level of support. What changes in 2010, not universal credit, what changes in 2010 is we keep ramping down the basic levels of support. We move to, first of all, 1% up ratings, then we freeze everything. So the basic level, that's what's getting you your destitution when the cost of living crisis happens. It's not universal credit, it's the system is just much less generous than it was. That's like £3,000 per household in lower income households, right? Those cuts since 2010 when the pandemic hits us. But then on top of that, since 2010, we've been salami slicing the extra cost benefits. So that's the housing benefit being cut down to the 30th percentile, getting you your homelessness problems coming through the door. It's disability cuts the system becoming more binary, trying to get people out of a middle ground. It's the two together. Basic rates just carrying on with the pre-2010 policy. Even New Labour kept on not uprating by more than Bennett prices the basic system, and then on top of that we've salami sliced, and then we've given back to the working population via a lower taper rate, and then we wonder why we've got food bank queues basically going on. Right, and I think we mustn't lose that 30-year story, because if you don't understand that we've kept ramping down the basic rate, then you wonder why things have got materially worse over this period. Right, disability. So Jamie's got a great question. So I think we should do some explaining here. Devon, your turn to do some explaining, because Kaylee's done loads. So the government back in last March, so March 23, says big reform, we're going to be scrapping the WCA.
Yeah.
So first of all, what is the WCA, for those, again, who aren't fitting in Alex's disgraceful description of everyone as nerds? What is it? Why on earth does he want to do this? Is anything actually happening?
All right. Well, I feel very used to delegating on these explanatory questions these days, but
Life's not fair.
I'll do my best. So yeah, work capability assessment introduced, I think, alongside employment support allowance, and determining the level of employment support allowance you got. So whether you're in the limited capability for work or limited capability for work related activity group, which basically means you're in both cases you're not expected to look for work, but one, you're not expected to look for work. You might be expected to look for work, prepare to look for work quite soon. The other one, you're not expected to prepare to look for work at all because of the level of your disability being so great. That is a system that was kind of relatively recently introduced as universal credit was kind of being talked about. They kind of looked at it as a fairly major reform, so that got carried basically directly into universal credit to assess those two same elements of support within universal credit: limited capability for work, limited capability for work-related activity. Now, because I'm not sure what that's kind of a high-level explanation of what it is. What's the next point? What was the question?
What's the government doing to this thing? So huge change just before the 2010 election. It's being rolled out as universal credit is going through. It gets brought into the system. Now everyone has decided, don't like that. Why not? Why is he trying to?
So these are levels of support related to your ability to work while you're disabled, rather than maybe the levels. Rather than the levels of support you need, additional levels of support you need for as a result of being disabled or ill.
Absolutely.
So they are suggesting that because the numbers have gone up, partly I assume this is all driven by the numbers in both of these groups going up considerably, and I think there are lots of other reasons why perhaps they've gone up considerably, which perhaps we'll have an opportunity to come on to. They've suggested that only if you're getting personal independence payment should you be eligible for the limited capability work-related activity component. So a lot of people who are currently receiving that as a result of not being able to work will then be expected to work as a result and lose that level of out-of-work support, which is quite a substantial change for those people, and perhaps has been thought through to bring them into conditionality, assuming that perhaps the assumption is that they should be able to look for some kind of work, surely, without really having done the homework to see whether or not that's a reasonable assumption to have made.
Very good. Okay, now if you...
Is that okay? Checking the audience, good.
So if we go back 15 years to when people are thinking about universal credit, this is the big change in the benefit system. Disability benefits were a small part of the benefit system in the 1980s. They're basically growing mainly as a way of dealing with people who were on long-term unemployed originally, and then later, as we go into the 2000s, we start seeing numbers ticking up. They're now a really big part of the benefits system.
Yep.
Are we fit for purpose? And what's going to happen now?
Are we fit for purpose? So I think it depends on the type of disability or health condition that you have and the impact that has on your kind of ability to work or deal with daily living tasks. For some, I think there are positives. For example, if you have been on disability or sickness benefits before, you haven't really had much contact with the system in the legacy benefit system and decades of policy around this area, whereas universal credit in a positive way potentially brings you into the system, so we can talk to you, we can find out whether you're getting the right amount of benefits, we can find out whether you need any support or the like. In reality, people find that incredibly challenging because it is an unemployment model that is going through, rather than something that is much more supportive for you if you do face additional challenges with work or life. I personally think that the WCA, obviously we're gonna lose the WCA if reforms carry on, is a missed opportunity. I feel like we're asking people a ton of questions, very personal, very detailed questions about their daily life, just to put them into a box of benefit eligibility, not to inform the system about how to work with that person. They then have to separately ask for reasonable adjustments, for example, if they can't go to their work coach appointment, not to inform the content of that work coach appointment. So are they talking to claimants about the types of work they can do based on what we've learned from that assessment? Not really, no. Like, somebody's going to have to go over all that again. And also on the fact that it's not advice driven. It very much is saying, okay, we're going to check whether you're eligible for something, thanks, bye. When it could be potentially saying, oh, we've noticed aids and adaptations you could use. We've noticed that you could use something from Access to Work to help you make working a reality. We've noticed that you struggle with getting out of the house. Here's support groups and support options that could be used. And it's just not doing anything like that. So it's just such a missed opportunity in that sense to me, and really quite a harsh system then to put people through just to be put into a different category of benefit entitlement.
Can we just remind you on the binariness of the system?
Yeah.
So there's always a need for some dividing lines in the system, but we have become much more binary over time.
I think so, and it's interesting because it's not just on severity of need, if you like. I think it's on things like duration of prognosis and the like that we've become much more binary. The system that you go through once you've given in your fit note is very similar, regardless of those things, which seems bizarre, like given the variation that it could lead to. And even if you look at sick pay and how that interacts with the system, that still is very fixed and stuck in like one mode. So yeah, I think what we're doing then, every time we ratchet up the threshold for severity and ratchet up the conditionality within the system and the working expectations in the system, is creating this bigger gap between the two for people. And the people who fall in that gap, the people, for example, who have a disability or a health problem but don't pass the PIP assessment, don't pass the WCA assessment, but still have barriers, those are the people where I feel like you could do so much to support them to get back to work or to increase their independence in life. But at the moment, they're kind of stuck in this gap in the middle between the system. So yeah, I would say that you should be targeting and focusing on that group in the inactivity challenge, rather than at the moment the design doesn't really highlight who they are.
No, that's definitely true.
And that group is what's creating a lot of worry around these reforms, is because the reform is to scrap the WCA. I think the binary that the government identified in there is real in terms of the way the system works, it tends to class people as they either can work or they can't work, and then give them extra money.
The government created that system in 2017 by removing the intermediate group by not paying any attention to what they were doing, delivering a cut, and then a few years later saying we appear to have created a binary system. That wasn't very sensible.
So now, obviously, it's incentivized to get put into the group that can't work because you get that extra element. You don't have the conditionality applied.
You're not covered by the benefit cap. We've created a huge incentive to prove you can't work, and then we're saying that wasn't very sensible, so let's scrap the whole thing without knowing where we're going to end up.
And it's hard to unwind from that. So I don't know if because it's already been removed for those people that are already kind of the stock of people who are already in that position. It's really hard to encourage them to maybe work with Job Centre Plus again, or kind of go into this intermediate group because it's not treated them. There's very little. Whereas actually, perhaps on the flow side, something like a beefed up statutory sick pay, where the employer is very incentivised as soon as someone gets off sick to get them back into work, or the Job Centre Plus is, once the employer's lost their responsibility, the Job Centre is very incentivised to do that. You could actually track the success of that, right? Are we stopping people in 6 months, in 1 year? Are they going back into work? If they're not, perhaps it's because they're of ill health, but generally you should be able to measure the effectiveness of that system.
I've had a bit mean to Jamie because I've used his question, which wasn't actually about scrapping the WCA. So this question, so there's two things going on that were announced in the last year and a bit. There's the scrapping of the WCA, which is like, I'll see you in 2027, 28, and honestly we'll have worked out what the new system looks like by then and legislated for it, maybe. That's the high profile thing, but what happened last September is salami slicing of a certain group who would have previously passed the WCA and received more support, and said those people in future won't qualify by removing some of the criteria that will get you points in the WCA. I'm not going to go into the weeds, everyone will go to sleep. But so a chunk of people are basically being cut out of the higher level of support. They'll no longer get as much support, and they won't be classified as not needing to work in the system. If you're in DWP, particularly on the political side, you watched yourself, you got announced that in September, you were very worried. Britain has a large disability lobby, and you thought you might get a big backlash because you basically announced a pretty chunky cut. That hasn't happened, which is interesting about the political economy of Britain. That backlash didn't happen. I would say why not? Because the disability lobby is very focused on the WCA, the test itself, the operation of the test, and it's slightly missed that a load of people just had their benefits cut quite a lot. I think it's about £1 billion in total. I can't remember, but it's a chunky amount of change. So DWP's lesson from that is the lobby's less powerful than we thought it was. We can come back for more. And I'll be surprised if we don't come back for more, because I want to finish on this about where we're actually going to be by the election. So we're not going to get a universal credit election because neither main political party particularly wants one. One lot doesn't want to boast about it particularly, another lot doesn't want to because the architects are long gone, and one lot doesn't want to talk about replacing it because the system's happening now and they've just watched how difficult it is to put a new system in place. So as our final question to each of you, which there's quite a few questions I won't bring one up, but there's lots of questions in this space, which is basically what's next? What's the focus of reform? What's the focus of changes to the benefit system in the next parliament, even as the numbers, because in lots of ways for DWP, the focus is delivering the migration. We've still got a lot of people to move on to the new system. That's a really big deal in administrative terms. I don't think, we should all think DWP has been doing a much better job of that over time in terms of informing people, taking them with them on the process. But let's have each of you. Alex, you work for us, so you get at least time to think.
All right,
what's your focus, Alex?
I thought we went the other way.
So yeah, I mean, I mentioned at the end of the talk there and in the report about the ill health caseload, but I think aside from that, I would hope there is some kind of prioritisation for just basic inadequacy of benefits. Getting some mechanism to get back to a level or to move towards a level where benefits can actually cover what people need to live. Removing some of the really sharp-edged things like the two-child limit and the benefit cap, and there has to be a way out of that. They're just mechanisms to push people into poverty. So I'm hoping that's where it goes.
Devon, what are we going to get?
Yeah, I'd make the same point I made earlier. Housing and health are probably bits outside of the benefit system that need to be tackled over the medium term. The question is kind of what's the journey of tackling those in the short term, because you can't have a lot of people be homeless while you build all these extra homes. That's going to make people's lives easier. So that trade-off is going to be critical, and it's something that just we weren't able to get across in 2010, 2015
and that is a really good point, because what always happens, so it's really easy. Politicians want to announce, I'm going to spend money on bricks, not on benefits, right? They want to say, I'm going to clamp down on the housing benefit bill today, because that's benefiting landlords, in brackets, that's not really true, and I'm going to use the money to build some houses to solve the problem for tomorrow, which is a political story.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. You can see the same thing happening in the disability space. I'm going to cut these disability benefits because this is going up by 30% in the next 5 years. I definitely can't have that happening. And I promise I'm going to provide you with some more support in your local area or in mental health support, and that will make the problem go away. So I'm not really cutting your benefits, but basically you end up doing the cut now and promising the better future tomorrow. And we don't build the houses, and on recent past we haven't done a great job on the provision of services for those in ill health or the disability either. But so keep that in mind. People on the left say this as much as people on the right. I regularly hear people saying we've got to cut this support because it's just a subsidy for kind of either badly paying employers or for landlords, ignoring the fact that what happens is some very poor people end up a lot poorer, and you don't build your houses because you're a bunch of NIMBYs anyway. Right, Kaylee, sorry. Last word to you.
It's a rant. Of,
sorry, done. Yeah.
There's a big backlog already.
Yes.
Of things to do, basically. There's a big backlog of things in terms of remaining build. There's a big backlog in terms of migration of universal credit, particularly from tax credits, and the ESA cohort group will push back even further. So there's lots there, and I'm sure if Neil was here, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he'd say, stop giving me more things to do. And I totally understand why he feels like that. In light of that, I think the short-term measures around cost of living that just have to happen, it's not something that is going away. We see it in our data, you've seen it in your data. This is not going to be a quick fix, regardless of minimum wage going up, regardless of uprating of benefits, as should happen. But lastly, I would just say on disability and health, what I would hope to see in terms of the next government is something that isn't rushed to find cost savings. I do think we're at a point where with reform in this world, we have done the same things over and over and over again and got the same results. Let's not do that. Please don't do that.
What percentage chance do you think there is of getting through the first year of any government, whoever wins this time, and not having announced big cuts to those disability benefits?
I mean, looking at the numbers, and I can imagine that the push will be from the Treasury team to make any changes within envelope. So if you want to move on cost of living, you potentially have to find savings in the disability and the health space. Understanding that and the kind of reality of that, I still think we shouldn't move to a world where you are tightening the criteria for eligibility and increasing conditionality, because we are just going to keep repeating that wheel, get nowhere.
I think that there are two ways you can make savings, right? So one is, if you had kept that intermediate rate, do you think you would have seen as many people on the higher rate as on the lower rate? So it's been a huge false economy, probably, almost certainly, right? You'd have to see, just at least if only 1 in 4 of those out in the limited capability related activity group were in the LCWA, that would have kind of paid for the savings itself. So there's huge opportunity.
That was just a really stupid thing to do.
It was a stupid thing to do. It's really hard to unwind, but actually if you introduce something back in the middle, that might actually just help kind of balance and stabilise those numbers a little bit. And I've forgotten the second thing.
Okay, excellent. Right, that's always the best way to finish an event, on the I forgot the key crucial thing.
Yeah.
That's the cliffhanger for the next Resolution Foundation event on universal credit. Look, can we all thank our panel for all their thoughts today? Well done, guys. Thank you all for coming. And when you're going through life, and lots of you work on this area, keep separate in your head levels of generosity and the actual nature of the system, because they are the devil in terms of us all getting to good outcomes. Off you go away and fix the system, everyone. Have a nice day.
Great. Thanks.